seeing so much ripping is because it's pretty reliable to get at least a half-ton response in the first year. You see a lot of sites like this with pretty obvious compaction, and half a tonne seems a pretty common first-year response. But one thing that we certainly did learn from last year is that we do need to consider things over 3 years. All right, so and I'll explain why in a minute. But we'll talk about costs first of all, the cost of ripping. Now, when I sort of scout around for likely costs, so you tell me what you reckon the cost of ripping is per hectare. I get quotes from $40 per hectare through to $120 per hectare for ripping down to 40 centimetres or below. Who reckons it's around 40? 50 per hectare? Higher? 70? What's your estimate? Who's done some ripping? It's got an estimate. Don't know?
So you're talking a contract rate or what?
No, this is farmers generally doing it themselves. Like
we're probably getting 5 hectares an hour and using 70 litres of diesel an hour, so 100, comes up to $100 an hour.
Depends how you guess the depreciation on your machine.
And tractor, yeah.
12,000 hours.
So that's the big thing. How do you spread the cost of machinery over time and over
diesel was $20 plus maybe double it.
And you get a very different value of labour as well. And some of the things that have been discussed here is also some of the follow-up treatments. You do the rolling. Hopefully you don't have to worry about resowing in some areas and things like that. So in the economics we've done so far, we've assumed around $85 per hectare. It'll go up if you use the inclusion plates because the extra drag and things like that. So I reckon that is a bit conservative. I'm probably more with you, but that sort of fits in with how farmers are costing it. So we really do have to look at what's going to happen this year to get the economic equation at those sites over 3 years. And so far the biomass is looking pretty good and the season's looking reasonable, very good. So we should get that back and be back in the black. But we've got a few sites that, because of last year, sitting around that sort of break even and even a slight loss. But in general, you're seeing this pretty reliable first-year response, and I think it was an extremely dry year in these environments. I forget the exact rainfall, almost none basically for the growing season. So that was a tough year, but a reminder that you do need to consider these things over 3 years. So what we're doing is sort of the return on investment, so that sort of upfront cost, and then looking at the return on investment over 3 years. And in a lot of cases, you're seeing that, like I said, with a half tonne, it only takes half a tonne to get your money back, and if you can keep the costs down to that sort of level, because you've got to think what sort of water limited yield we're dealing with on these types of soils and in some of these environments. So I guess that's the challenge. And in some of these things we've had spading alongside, and I mean the ripping will win if you're not dealing with the non-wetting and some of those other benefits, because it's just a lower cost as well, and the spading not going quite as deep if compaction is the main constraint. So that's the big thing. And where you do see spading win out in some of these other treatments is where you're dealing with the non-wetting and some of these other things.
The cost of on-row sowing?
Well, there has been work done on the on-row sowing. So Ed did work with us looking at the on-row sowing. You've got the establishment benefits there, but it's just the challenge of doing it and what sort of machinery you need to make that possible. All right, or even near row sowing. So that's a pretty variable cost for a lot of people, and in some cases not even possible, you'd argue, without a bit more technical development. But that's certainly something we're looking at, because that's shown some really good establishment responses in our trials, but getting it to practically work is the next step reliably. So, typically we'll be aiming for 2 to 1 benefit cost ratio, sort of doubling your money basically, and over the 3 years you'd hope you get it. Some of these sites where we've got the 3 years, it is showing that, and hopefully once we get some of the results from trials like this coming in to add to that, we'll get a really good picture of how it relates to the compaction, non-wetting, and then the returns you might get for these different treatments. So I guess the message is we need to wait for this very important season. And with amazing sites like this, it's shaping up pretty well. There's some amazing ripping responses in here, and this data will be really, really important.
Excellent. And if you want to hear a bit more from Rick, we've done a podcast on this as well, so you can hear it all over again.
Where I say in the podcast you need to wait for another year for the results.